First of all, thank you, Sanja, for this very kind introduction. And I would like to thank Jeleva, chair of a program board. I would like to thank Edward Georgievich for inviting me and us here, and for the wonderful organization for making this important and great conference possible. I had so many important discussions and insights. Especially, I would also like to thank the group of activist scholars who organized the tour, the city tour, the alternative city tour on Wednesday. And I see some of you here as well. And I already learned a lot about that. And I hope we can continue, especially also this debate about the changing cities. And I started with that particular topic of housing in a, if you so want, personal way, because my neighbors, and this is a story I heard on Wednesday, but it's a story all of you may have heard in your particular city. So neighbors, an elderly couple has been evicted from a Frankfurt house. Because this house has been sold, it has been shared and divided into different ownership parts. And after 5 years, this is the German regulation, it's very particular, it's possible to evict people if one claims personal use. And that is exactly what was happening. This couple had to move. It was very difficult for them to find a new home. Of course not, because one of the two was unemployed by then. And so they now live a bit on the outskirts of Frankfurt. They found something, but it's not comparable to the location they lived in for all their life. And so I'm interested in finding out a bit more about this injustice, I think, and that's how it started. I worked on injustice back then, and I think it is an injustice. But the question is also what exactly makes this kind of legal, completely legal eviction actually unjust, right? And this is not so much I would like to talk about today, because today I would like to focus on the underlying property conception. So my focus here is the property conception, but we can, in the debate, then speak about all different kinds of problems that are addressed with that topic. I start my talk here with what I call diagnosis. And the title is Who Owns the City? I mean, it's a title of a graffiti that you find in many cities. You find it almost everywhere, who owns the city? And it formulates a rhetorical question of activist groups whose answer is usually, I think that's what behind it, is the city belongs to its citizens. And de facto, however, the cities, in plural actually, often belongs to those who have the power and the money to shape a city, be it a major city or even a smaller city nowadays, even if it's a village, as they like it, if to say. And this kind of eviction is not so new. Friedrich Engels, for example, described the displacement of poorer sections of the population also already in his famous book. Some of you may know that, The Question of Housing. He described it with regard to London and Paris. And in Paris, this is known as the Usmanization, you know that these large alleys, the suitable living spaces for the bourgeois class at the city center. And that has also had an interesting side effect, this kind of eviction, because now there was space for military marches and parades and a possible control of the population during riots. So this kind of urban planning always had many purposes, not just to make money, but it very often had also something to do with securitization in our system, to find out about controlling the population. What many of us are talking about is what one calls usually gentrification. That's this kind of displacement in all kinds of ways. Tenants and small businesses are evicted, are displaced by higher earners or chain stores. And especially in the cities also like Beograd, one can see that this kind of displacement does not only affect tenants, but also small businesses. And it's a bit of the same procedure behind it. And however, part of the diagnosis here is that that's a problem, but it's only one part of the problem. As I think more decisive for commodification on a large scale is a structural lawlessness. So it's not just about the gentrification. It's not just about the fact that there are bubble teas and other chains pop up in your neighborhood and rents are rising and people got evicted. It's one also needs to look behind the scene and having a closer look at the structural problems. And one of that is a kind of lawlessness that goes hand in hand with the marketing of entire streets and neighborhoods and allows ownership structures to be concealed and further fuel speculation with housing. And it is in this, and for example, I mean, there are so many examples, like in London, you can see that there are whole streets without somebody living in there. There are no longer kids living in there because there are empty flats all over. And, but even that is not yet the full story. So there is another level, if you so want. So there's this gentrification on a more interactional level. There is this structural lawlessness, which also causes, by the way, I don't want to go into that here, which also causes money laundering in all European countries to a very high degree. And on a third level, there is, through that legal vacuum, one can see a kind of financialization of the housing market itself. So it's a kind of meta level where we find another capital cycle. So we are used to two capital cycles, a primary one of production and a secondary one for investment in infrastructure projects, such as also housing construction. But then also after 2008, after the financial crisis, we witnessed a declining in profitability in these areas under the auspices of neoliberal politics. And what happened was that there's a parallel deregulation of the financial market, which created a third cycle. And now these financial products could be created and exchanged independently of traditional production and infrastructure development. So it's a kind of betting on the future of that particular market. So it's completely disconnected from the original idea that there is something like housing for people in the cities. Okay. The effects are, just to wrap them up here a bit, the part of the diagnosis, the effect is housing and apartment prices were no longer generated by supply and demand for housing, but by housing finance projects. Secondly, the perspective of betting on the future of the financial market came to the fore, and quite independently of the actual marketing of condominiums and houses. And third, this created a globalized mortgage market in which mortgage portfolios are constantly being repacked and traded on the financial market. So there is this kind of mortgage loan security and insecurity, which we heard also on the city tour on Wednesday. And that affects, for example, Roma minorities, but of course not only. So there are so many people affected by the mortgage crisis. All right, I said that. So for many, housing is almost unaffordable and has become a financial and existential risk. And the housing poor is now being a new awful word for what's going on, not just in, and I'm talking here about the European cities more or less, but it's going on in almost any parts of the world, not just in the global north, but in also other parts of the world with particular problems. So for example, South Africa with a post-apartheid situation and so on. But it would be too complex. I leave that out here. All right. Anyway, just a last word on that here. Like in the days of Marx, owning an individual home is nevertheless, and if I talk to younger people, it's the more so, I think, an ideologically entrenched institution. Home ownership promises a lot. And I do have here a Hegelian approach, that's why I want to tell you that, in the sense, well, there is this ideological institution that you need to have your own home, cost it whatever it may cost. And home ownership promises individual freedom, economic security, provision for old age, social and political prestige, although we can now really see that neither then nor now these promises have been fulfilled. And nevertheless, it's still there for different reasons. Our world is so insecure, and then people want to have their own home at least, and so on and so forth. At the same time, what not many people may know, I think here in the room well, but not many know that housing is now recognized as a basic need, and it's a human right. So in 1976, several international human rights conventions described adequate housing as something that's a prerequisite for a dignified existence. And it's on the same footing as a law, if you want, like a protection against arbitrary arrest and torture. So we have it already, this kind of legal protection. However, we can say, as the second part of the diagnosis here, that housing is a commodity. It has turned already for long into a commodity. And at the same time, it's a need and a human right. So there is this tension we are dealing with here. I would like to defend in what's following three theses, which I want to offer here. It's not a surprise. I would first like to argue that individual home ownership is a problem, even though some here in the room may be not buying this point. And I argue for a collective property right when it comes to housing and other infrastructure goods. So that's the first point. Second, this requires a change of perspective from the legal subject, who is an individual, can dispose of property, to various goods. And I think I would like to shift the focus here onto about what goods we are actually talking about when we talk about collective property ownership. That's pretty unusual if we look from a legal point of view. So that's why I'm a bit into that here, because that's politically you might think that's plausible, but juridically it's not, philosophically also not. And third, collective home ownership ensures a symmetrical form of political membership, and that's another argument I want to make. It's all about political membership on an equal political membership, because I think that individual property rights are in tension with equal political membership. Even so, a lot of liberals are arguing exactly against that part here. So individual ownership trap is the first aspect here. There is this standard view, and it's a standard philosophical view that we have something like individual property right, and that's something we need to be very aware of and protect. And it goes back into the 18th century, property as a person-thing relation. So if we think about relationship with property, then it's about a person and a thing. And almost everybody, from Blackstone over Locke and Kant, they all have talked about this kind of, and Hegel, this kind of person-thing relationship. And the concept of property under private law is the view of property as a relationship of domination between a person and a thing, where it comes to an identification of property and a thing. Accordingly, owners have the sole absolute power of despotism over their property and all others. And that's very important, we will come back to that. By having this individual property right, it's possible to exclude others. I mean, this is the major thing about the person-thing relationship. Just briefly, to put here on the table how important this thinking is for us. You can also find it already in John Locke. You may know this, probably I will be short on that. John Locke tried to legitimize the privatization of property. In other words, he tries to legitimize the transfer of an object from its original common ownership of the power of disposal of individuals. So what Locke was doing, if you have read it, it was a lot of work to do to justify why suddenly land which has been owned commonly should no longer be owned commonly. So the pressure to justification laid in making it individual. So what was his argument? Oh, he suggested that the use of land, the use of especially land, coincides with the consumption of an object as well as the exclusion of others from use. And there was, so far, and you know that, it's about there should be enough for everybody else and so on and so forth. But there was a further argument. The things that belong to one should be allowed to be used for any advantage. So there was this further argumentation. You can do everything with that, but there need to be a kind of advantage in that. And I mean, if you read Locke again, then you can see there are kind of loops here, and it's not always plausible argumentation. And what we have here is, first of all, an atomistic conception of labor that leads to individual abuse of property. What was Locke arguing? He said, for example, his servant works, but we all know, and Locke knew, his servant, even though he works on land for getting some fruits out of the earth and so on, the servant would never own land. Why? It follows from the common processing that it becomes common property. That's what actually should be the effect. But it was completely detached from the context. And there was a kind of class system within Locke right from the beginning. So it was not his servant, but it was Locke's property. Secondly, also justification for acquisition of property was here at stake. It was happening in the context of colonization. Locke equates the prohibition of waste. There should not be any waste. So you should not, grow fruits that you cannot use yourself. But Locke equates the prohibition of waste with the commandment to cultivate. And then was this famous sentence that American land was determined as wasteland and indigenous land use as leaving fallow. So because if you do not work on that land, it's wasteland. And so that was a kind of legitimizing the legitimizing of colonialism in this. So that's part of the context we are talking about here. Then, I will be brief on that. What's also very predominant still in legal thinking is the so-called bundle theory. Wesley, Hofeld, Kelsen, Kirby, Epstein, and others. And this is still also very prevalent in EU law thinking. And what does it mean? It's in a way, it's a criticism of the person-thing relationship. But it stays in this individual liberal frame. But it says something like, well, we have 4 legal relationships, claim rights, for example, privilege, power, immunity. And property rights are not so much a person-thing relationship, but they are relational. They are never total. They never have the full power on something. And therefore, property has degrees. An owner can assign rights without ceasing to be the owner. In case of renting, for example, so that makes it probably very clear, you own an apartment, you rent it out, but even so somebody else lives and uses that apartment, it's still yours. So that's why Hofeld says something, there's a bundle of rights. So this is a different relationship in law. And there are all kinds of criticisms on that. And I think the most important one is the last here in the row. Still, the bundle theory says, well, almost everything can become a tradable good that individuals own. Why? Because it does not look at what is the good that's being protected through the law, but it still remains on the side of the individual law person. So that's one of the problems. It's not it does not refer to the de-objectification. So another scholar, van der Velde, for example, described it. So the first thesis, to sum up that part here, the first thesis I have defended is that liberal individual property rights are a structural component of modern capitalist societies, and following the existing market logic, are encroaching on more and more areas of society and can fulfill their implicit promise of freedom and security. So that's the first point here. And that has something to do with not focusing on the goods that are protected through property rights. Now, let's turn, second step here, let's turn to from material property, the ownership of things, and the relational idea of property rights, to the ownership of goods. And I think that makes really a difference here. Coded exclusively from the legal subjects, owners have the right to freely dispose of what belongs to them, we have seen. And what counts as an object very often is determined by the right of freedom. So we have a whole tradition in philosophy of saying it's important to speak here about the right to freedom. So the entitlement of Nozick, the occupation theory of Immanuel Kant. You can also add Hegel. It's all about owning something that makes you even only a subject. And the legal code thing erases all the specific features of a property object. Everything, natural goods, consumer goods, housing, can become property and can become tradable. That need not be the case. If you look into the theory of goods, one can at least distinguish here 4 types. And the 4th type, of course, is the most important here. But I will mention briefly the first 3 as well. So, for example, we have consumer and durable goods. So food, computers, clothing, and with them come further obligations regarding ecological production of foodstuff, for example, right? Then we have productive goods. Material objects like machines, equipment, tools, what in a Marxian term, productive goods, so the conditions of producing something. Investments, capital, assets. We have natural goods. Those are used but not produced by mankind. It's a production in itself. Energy resources, coal, oil, solar, wind, water, and so on. And then we have a category of goods, and that's one of the major things here I want to say, which I call infrastructure goods. And infrastructure goods that infrastructures make goods and services accessible to the entire population and ensure a minimum standard of living and quality of life. And something like electricity, water, heat, communication, mobility, health, education, culture, land, and housing belongs to it. And of course, as you know, it's about housing and land here. So I think housing also belongs to those infrastructure goods. Of course, I need to explain that a bit, because you can say, well, why housing? You know, it has nothing to do. It's not an infrastructure good. It belongs to me. And but I think housing, first of all, is a basic need, and one can. There's a long debate about that, but it's, in my view, also an anthropological condition. It's a human right, we heard about that. And it's a condition for societal participation. So if you don't have a proper and adequate housing, you cannot do anything, and you cannot become a full-fledged political member. Housing is very much entangled and entwined with the environment, the natural environment. And I think environment, and I would like to argue for that as well, is also an infrastructure good. But the major argument here is that a secure, not alienated and adequate housing allows equal political participation on the basis of cooperation. And housing, in my view, belongs exactly in that category. There, it's not that easy, as you can. So maybe some of you have heard about the common classification of goods that distinguishes private goods from public goods. And this debate uses the distinction between rigorous and excludable goods. So I want to be brief on that because this is surely some of the objections that may come up here. A good is rigorous if and only if the consumption of one individual restricts the ability of others to consume it. So if I eat your lunch, then there is no lunch for you left. That's pretty clear. A good is excludable if it's possible to prevent individuals from consuming it and to draw a fence around it. And public goods by Ostrom, for example, Musgrave and others, public goods are usually defined as being non-rigorous and non-excludable. So in that way, you can already see housing does not belong to it, right? Because if I live in that apartment, I live there and you can't, so it's excludable. It's rigorous in a sense of if I live there, then I diminish the access for you as well. So actually, it's not a public good, and it's probably because it's not a public good, even so I would say housing is a public good, but also a private good if it's used collectively. But so maybe there we have a problem now. But I think if we look closer to that argumentation, which is absolutely predominant when it comes to the goods, then we can see that this distinction of what then remains be public, national defense, fire protection, global climate measures, is very arbitrarily done. So for example, one of those examples you can read also is that seats in the theater to listen to Bruckner's symphony is limited. And so even it's supposedly non-exclusable, rigorous goods, it's still something that excludes people if there are not enough seats. So even that very often used example of listening to music is excludable. At the same time, what Ostrom uses very often, fish stock, is non-rigorous, as if there is enough fish stock in the ocean. But if too many people eat fish, then even this criteria no longer is available. So I would say it's a kind of arbitrary drawn distinction here, which we can get rid of. And what remains, in my view, it's a bit shortcut here. It's a bit of a shortcut here. We can speak of collective goods as those that are produced and used privately or publicly, but which also serves the purpose of enabling political membership. And that's the major point here I want to do. So collective ownership, which concerns common infrastructure goods, is the form of ownership that removes energy, health, mobility, housing supply from the market and the pre-political liberal understanding of ownership. So that's the argument I want to make here in that second step. Why is political membership here so important? As a legal member of a society, in order to have an equal say in decommodifying property relations, it's important that there is, in a way, to see that it's about being an equal membership at first. So the power relations start with defining what belongs to, of what goods are we talking, actually. So that's how it all starts. What belongs to the collective ownership? What goods, I can tell you that here, but that's my, if you so want, theory suggestion, and to, at some point, maybe change the law. But I also think it's, at the end of the day, about everyone to define in a collective political process what are infrastructural goods. Okay, just a last point on that here. The political members as a whole, I want to say, determine how important goods are to be used. So it's linked to kind of internal democratic process to find out about what collective ownership law may look like. These determinations are made on the basis of the social interest through mechanisms of collective decision-making, ideally democratically, within a cooperative, within a housing group, a housing project, and governance by rules whose point is to make the good available for use by all or any member in a society to come up with an affordable, adequate housing for everyone. So the second thesis, and there's just a third little part, but the second thesis is, it is not forms of ownership per se that are problematic, but the individual form of ownership, which is based exclusively on the legal subject and refers to material property, and not to the cooperative organizations of goods in form of collective property, especially infrastructure goods. So I'm talking here about collective housing property. This is the term I would like to defend. This is the term I think should be more prevalent in property law, which is not yet the case. So that's about change. So now starts the last paragraph. It will not take too long here. So collective ownership is unusual in legal terms. It's most likely so far in cooperative law still. What I'm doing here is, it's a kind of Hegelian approach. I want to look at what we have and find out how we can change what we have by, at the end, overcoming exactly that structure. So the special feature of cooperative residential property is that although it's private property, it's not individual ownership of the residential property occupied, rather it's ownership of the entirely cooperative, which all members hold together. So the idea here is that maybe as it's in Vienna, that you, or as we have here, I have here an example of Germany. It's called Rental House Syndicate. It's a cooperatively and non-commercially organized investment company for the joint acquisition of houses, which are transferred to collective ownership in order to create long-term affordable housing and space for individuals. This particular project, housing project, is founded in 1992 already. And there are, it's not that many, but at the same time, it already depends, as you say, the glass is half full or half empty. There are 121 houses in self-administration. And it's based on the idea that those corporations give mutual credits. So there is no bank plays a role here. And there's also another initiative now, you may have heard about this. It's called the German Housing and Co-Expropriate. And it's a citizens' initiative in Berlin that has been active since 2018 and achieved a successful referendum on the expropriation and socialization of private housing companies in September 2021. The referendum has not yet been implemented because the politicians of Berlin city-state say, oh, it's nice that we have that referendum, but let's see what's going to happen. The referendum has not yet been implemented. In December 2023, the initiative announced that it would put its goal of socializing housing to the vote again with the statutory referendum. And one needs to say here maybe that it's only about huge housing companies that have more than 10,000 apartments in their stock. So it's not about the little housing owners, so to keep the fear out of here from this, but it's about the huge companies, and they should be expropriated. And for the background here is that the city of Berlin, like many other European cities, have sold those formerly social housing projects for almost nothing 20 years ago. And now the question is in how far they can get it back. You know, it's a kind of crazy situation here. I would like to recommend Stavros Stavridis' books on commons. It's also, I think, a bit of it's same. There might be different approaches, but there are many others, like the Vienna examples, like Helvrich speaking about the commons. So the idea here actually is that housing should be an infrastructure good that is available to everyone, and it should be the possibility to move in and out by becoming a member easily. So that's actually the idea. One can now object briefly. My apartment finances my pension. I hear that very often. Yeah? Pension provision is also an infrastructure service and should be financed by everyone, as in the Netherlands, Switzerland, and partly in Germany. So I think that's not a good argument, because we have to then speak about how old age pension is really organized, and not on an individual basis, but also as a collective basis. Second objection. Do you then have to live, do I then have closely live with everyone? Oh, that's not my thing. So there's very often this idea that you just have one room in a huge living together idea. And so I think then one can object here or say against that. There are many forms of collective co-housing. The major thing is that it's organized in a cooperative way. And that you become your own owner together with others. So that makes also housing very secure. Like Madden and Marcuse have coined the notion of housing alienation. Why? Because housing has become so insecure. And also, I think renting is also housing alienation. And it also, this kind of cooperative living eliminates the proprietary deformation of subjectivity, I think, that arises from the compulsion to individual ownership, which only the fewest can afford. So it's also this idea, or it gets a hold on the idea that everybody has to struggle, take on huge mortgages to finance your own housing. And you may then, that might be one of the objections here, so then we have less questions later. Why ownership at all? You know, that's also a question that comes very, why ownership at all? That comes from the other side, so to say, you know, so why not then give it up at all? And well, here I think I just hesitate to say, no, we don't need any ownership law at all, because we live in a property political order system that's difficult to overturn completely. Beating the promise of ownership by its own means, I think, is the better way to do. By saying, you know, we start exactly from the situation we live in, and we try to overcome and change the legal situation from within. And collective ownership by law secures desires from other capital-rich investors. from the arbitrariness of the state and the law. And that's also, I think, a very important aspect. If you look at, sometimes I'm also in Colombia and in other Latin American countries, and then what one learns there is that to have a kind of law protection is very important. So it's more about the internal structure of how housing is organized, but that then should be organized in a way that there is a secure way of keeping a collective ownership law. Because otherwise it may be up for further state intrusion, for other bigger companies buying that or taking over. So far I think there should be some collective ownership law. But there should be a kind of socialization of housing that's in the hand of those who live in that, not as an individual asset, but as collective, collective property. So that's the last slide. The third thesis, collective ownership is cooperative, creates self-effectiveness, housing security and political self-determination. It's based on a concept of ownership of infrastructure goods and not on the usual ownership of property. It also enables internal cooperative self-determination about a fundamental condition of life, such as how we live. And it's linked internally to democratization. To answer the question of the beginning, who owns the city, I would say the city belongs to those who shape it, who shape the city cooperatively. And that's the way, the change should happen at some point in the not so far future. Thank you for your attention, and I'm now looking forward to your comments and questions and so on. Thank you.